Right, I want to welcome you to the Data for Nutrition webinar series on fortification. We're excited today to be talking about using data for decision-making in large-scale food fortification with some examples from the country and regional level. I want to welcome all of you who are joining us live and also those who are watching this on recording. We're glad to have you. Next slide. So just some logistics before we start. So all participant videos and microphones are muted during the presentations. So we will not be using videos during this session. We encourage you to specifically use the Q&A button to submit your questions for the speakers. We'll get to as many questions as we can when we shift to the Q&A, but you can go ahead and put those questions in at any time while they're speaking, and then we'll come back and we'll review through that Q&A function. I just want to remind you that a recording of this webinar will be available on the Data for Nutrition YouTube channel immediately, and that we will post the slides and a Q&A summary in the coming week. Next slide. So just want to remind folks that the Data for Nutrition community of practice exists to provide members with opportunities to share knowledge, experience, and questions that are relevant to strengthening the nutrition data value chain. And we welcome all of our 1,000 and growing number of members to use this as a platform to share. So if you're interested in doing a webinar that highlights your work, please reach out to us. I'm your moderator today, Rebecca Heitkamp, and I'm an associate scientist at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and lead the DataDent initiative. Next slide. I want to encourage folks for a special event that's following up. The GFDx team is going to be leading a live discussion on the Data for Nutrition community practice starting today through August 4th. So we encourage you to go to the community of practice itself and to go ahead and comment on the post that's created by the GFDx team, or you can create your own post on this discussion through August 4th. And we'll swing back and remind you about this again at the end, but encourage you to follow up and participate in that event on the community. Next slide. So I want to introduce you to today's speakers. Florencia Vasta is a member of the Global Fortification Data Exchange Secretariat and is currently a senior associate at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. She's been involved in a number of projects related to food fortification, including improving data collection tools, data systems for enhanced decision-making at country and regional level. She's involved in private and public partnerships and cross-sector partnerships, as well as country and regional level technical support for fortification programs in Asia and Africa. Also welcome Becky Tsang, who is the project manager at GFDx, a technical officer at the Food Fortification Initiative in Asia, as well as a project coordinator with the Iodine Global Network. So she wears many hats in the fortification space and has worked on projects including landscape analyses to identify opportunities for fortification, to provide technical support to governments and partners to plan, implement, and evaluate cereal grain fortification, as well as conducting systematic reviews on fortification evidence. So welcome, Florencia and Becky, and we'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having us, Rebecca. So my name is Florencia Vasta, and I'm here with my colleague, Becky Tsang. We represent members of the Global Fortification Data Exchange Secretariat. And first of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for making the time today for this webinar on the GFDx platform, which we're really excited to share with you. As many of you may not be familiar with the platform, we'll first give you an introduction on the GFDx. We'll walk through some of its features and the type of data we house. And then we'll take you through some examples, as Rebecca mentioned, of how the GFDx can be used for decision-making, both at the country and the regional level. So I'll just set the context here with what is large-scale food fortification. So more than 2 billion people worldwide suffer from micronutrient deficiencies because they do not consume enough essential vitamins and minerals in their daily diets. This is a major public health issue that can affect all age groups in any country, including low, middle, and high-income nations. So micronutrient deficiencies can cause irreversible damage, leading to morbidity and mortality. Large-scale food fortification, also known as mass fortification or industrial food fortification, is cost-effective, safe, and requires little to no behavior change. Since the vitamins and minerals are added directly by producers to staple foods that are commonly consumed by most of the population, like flours, cooking oils, table salt, etc., this intervention can actually be scaled up and sustainable. So as of today, more than 140 countries have mandatory or voluntary legislation of at least one staple food. And this is among maize flour, oil, rice, salt, or wheat flour. So how did the GFDx platform come to exist? The Global Fortification Data Exchange, or what we call GFDx, was actually an effort that responded to a major challenge raised by the food fortification community. During the first Global Summit on Food Fortification in Arusha, which some of you may have attended, governments, NGOs, civil society, donors, and researchers all came together to align on a common fortification agenda for the next 5 years. As they were discussing the importance of data, they came to the realization that many different stakeholders in the room collected and housed data in many different ways and in different places. And there was really no one-stop shop for data on fortification globally. So as more countries committed to adopting fortification programs, stakeholders raised a call for better accessibility to inform policy, look at program overlap, identify populations in need of fortification programming, and to measure global progress. And this was all formalized in a call to action in the 2015 Arusha Statement on Food Fortification. So as a response, several organizations came together to create the GFDx, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the organizations leading this are GAIN, IGN, Iodine Global Network, Food Fortification Initiative, and also in close collaboration with our partner Micronutrient Forum. So the GFDx is an interactive visualization tool to empower the global fortification community and in-country stakeholders to make data-driven decisions on food fortification policies and programs. Data can be downloaded for analysis or can be used directly on the site to make custom maps. So where does this data actually come from? All data in the GFDx come from countries themselves and national programs. Every 2 years, we come out with a survey, the GFDx Secretariat sends it out, of questions for countries asking for their fortification data to be contributed to the site. We contact different ministries responsible for fortification, different NGOs in the country with programs in fortification, and others that may gather the national data either through surveys or their research. And consolidating available data for different foods allows national decision makers to more holistically and comprehensively view their fortification programs, identify gaps, and make comparisons across foods between countries, and the fortification community can, like I said, track global progress. So the GFDx not only provides data on fortification by country, but it's also a program and platform with plenty of resources for users on things like fortification during COVID, links for premix suppliers, fortification guidelines for users in country or globally, and resources for advocacy and more. So what type of data do we have? We currently have data for 196 countries on 5 of the most commonly fortified foods, which are maize flour, oil, rice, salt, and wheat flour. The type of data we compile can be organized into 3 broad categories. The first category is foundational documents, and these are documents to establish a good architecture framework for a country's fortification program. The second is fortification potential or opportunity, and as it sounds, it includes indicators that provide information to determine the fortification potential of a food in a country. And the third category is program performance, and this includes indicators that give us information to determine how well a program is performing and functioning. And I'll dig into these a little bit more. In 2017, we released data globally on 3 indicators, which are legislation, standards, and food intake and availability. And a few years later, we added information on indicators like the presence of regulatory monitoring protocols, actual data on fortification quality and compliance by country, population coverage of fortified foods, legislative scope, and percent of food vehicle industrially processed in a country. And then last year, we released a set of new indicators such as health impact, which shows the impact of fortification on nutrient status in the population, as well as analytical indicators that are based on our own GFDx analyses, such as programmatic quality, expected nutrient contribution, alignment with WHO recommendations, and alignment with legislative standards and monitoring practices. So now we're going to give you a few examples of how the GFDx platform can be used both at the national and the regional level to help with decision making. So I'll hand it over now to Becky.
Thanks, Florencia. Good morning, everyone. So before I go into these examples, I just want to preface that the situations are either hypothetical in that we've gotten similar questions, but they may not be exactly the same ones that you see here, or they may be loosely based on data requests received by the GFDx. We didn't want to, specifically call out countries that have actually asked certain questions, and so we may have substituted different countries, different foods, also depending on the type of data that we do have available within the GFDx. So just wanted to preface there, we do use as examples country names, but they may not be the actual countries that ask those questions. So go ahead, thank you. All right, so the first basic question is we often get asked, or fortification partners often get asked, how do we know whether a food is a good opportunity for food fortification? And so a lot of these examples that we're going to run through kind of are role-playing situations where someone is asking a certain question and we're trying to see how the GFDx can answer it. So just as an example, imagine that you're a nutrition officer within the Ministry of Health in Sri Lanka, and you're working on the next national nutrition strategy for food fortification. Currently, there is no mandatory food fortification within Sri Lanka. The GFDx would also have that information. You've heard generally that there are countries that fortify wheat flour, maize flour, salt, and oil, in addition to potentially other foods. You haven't heard quite as much about rice fortification programs globally, but you do know from living in Sri Lanka that it's much more widely consumed than wheat flour, maize flour. So, to you, it makes more sense to fortify rice. But are there other considerations that are really important in choosing what foods to fortify other than just the amount or food that you consume? Next. So on the GFDx, we have on the country dashboards a combination of 3 different indicators. You'll see these on the dials. If there were data on the middle one, the population coverage of rice, you would see a dial there. On the country dashboard, we actually have an interpretation of whether a food is a poor, moderate, or high good opportunity for fortification. And so you'll see that interpretation for each food on the site. And then there will be a program suggestion based on the fortification status of that country, whether it's a good opportunity. The algorithm that we use to produce the poor, moderate, or high opportunity incorporates the fact that there is no data on population coverage of rice. So if this nutrition officer were to go to the Sri Lanka country profile, country dashboard on the GFDx site, they would see, looking at rice, well, even though it's such a high food availability, 450 grams per capita per day available per person, that's a ton of rice. That seems like a great opportunity. But if you look at the proportion that's industrially processed, it's relatively low, about a third of the rice that's available in the country. And so it's only considered moderate. However, if you're looking at wheat flour, even though the daily food availability is relatively much lower than rice, 113, 114 grams per capita per day, it's considered a good opportunity for national level impact because there is 100% of the flour that is industrially produced in the country. So really, we want to take into consideration not just that the food is available, the amount that is available, but really, can it be fortified through the industrial processing within the country? Obviously, if there was actually information on population coverage of these foods in that country, then that would be additional information that would help guide whether the food is a high, moderate, or poor opportunity for fortification. Looking at the other foods within the GFDx, the interpretation for maize flour is poor, for oil it's moderate, and for salt it's good. So this is an example of how information within the GFDx can help guide countries towards understanding, what are the basic parameters to understand whether you would actually decide whether something's a good opportunity for food fortification. Next slide. All right. And understanding legislation scope. I think, if anyone here has a basic understanding of food fortification, you've often seen slides about the number of countries with food fortification in place, mandatory or voluntary. But that's not really the whole story when it comes to food fortification. A country can have mandatory food fortification, but not all of the foods in that country, not all of the, for example, wheat flour types will have to be fortified within that country, or all of the types of salt. So then it's really important to actually know what types of salt, what types of wheat flour have to be fortified within that country, because again, it matters how people are accessing that food and what foods are consuming it within. So as an example, imagine the Ministry of Health in Namibia, they've just completed a national nutrition survey. A key finding from that dietary survey was that processed foods are the primary source of consumed salt in the country, not salt added at the table. And I imagine this is something that, it's a dietary pattern that is occurring all over the world, and so not very surprising. Now, if you look at the Namibia food dashboard, you can see under legislation scope for salt in Namibia. First off, we have 3 categories for legislation scope. First is where is it going to, or where is it coming from that the salt must be fortified. So we see in the Namibia that mandatory fortification has been there since 1994. It states in the legislation that it must be any salt industrially produced, salt that is domestically produced must be fortified. Imported salt also must be fortified. Exported salt does not need to be fortified. That's often the case because countries must adhere to the regulations of the exporting country or the country receiving the salt. Now, looking at the intended use of salt, legislations also specify, well, how should the salt be used if it's going to be fortified? Under Namibia's regulations, household salt must be fortified. Processed food salt does not need to be fortified. Salt used in animal feed and donated food does not need to be fortified. And then under types of salt that must be fortified, it doesn't specify any exceptions, so it's interpreted that all types must be fortified, meaning even crude salt, refined salt, specialty salts, etc. Now you'll see those magnifying glasses that are next to those the types intended use of salt that have to be fortified, and those are to provide just informational prompts about maybe you should look into this a little bit further, depending on how important this source or intended use of salt is in that country. So under processed food, that little magnifying glass, if you hovered over it, says, if a significant amount of salt is used in processed foods, for example, bouillon, bread, noodles, etc., you should consider expanding legislation scope to include fortification of salt used as an ingredient in the manufacture of processed foods. This will increase access to and consumption of fortified salt and nutritional impact. So this is just, the Ministry of Health individual would need to know, obviously, that processed food is the primary source of consumed salt in the country, and they would see under legislation scope that in Namibia, that's not currently covered. Next slide. Now, another way, if you could go back to that last bullet. Now, another way they can use the legislation scope information is that, responding to food industry, and this is a variation of questions that we have received from the GFDx. The food industry may not be supportive of adding fortified salt during food processing, and a country may want to know, well, how often is it actually the case in practice that countries require processed food to have fortified salt or the fortified ingredient within it? And so that's another resource or information point that GFDx can provide is globally, how many countries require processed food to include the fortified ingredient? Next slide. Next is, again, going beyond whether fortification is mandatory or voluntary, but what are the details within food fortification legislation and regulations? So what nutrient compounds and levels should be used in food fortification? It's not enough to just add iron, but we need to be adding ideally the correct type of iron and the correct levels of iron. So, imagine you're working in the Africa region for one of the UN agencies, and you are trying to understand how you should target your resources to improve national fortification programs within the region. You're aware that countries may not have ideal legislation or regulations around food fortification, but what countries actually need that support to improve their national standards. So one of the analyses that GFDx has on the site, we have two of these for WHO guidelines. One compares national fortification standards with WHO guidelines for nutrient compounds. And the other one is the same analysis, but then it compares nutrient levels, so the amount of the nutrient that is added within. And it's important to note that WHO guidelines exist for compounds and levels for wheat flour, maize flour, and salt. There are WHO guidelines for rice, but they don't specify compounds or levels, so that is not within the GFDx to conduct an analysis on, and they do not yet exist for oil. So looking at this example for Chad, for WHO guidelines for nutrient compounds, if we look at wheat flour is the food, iron is the nutrient that's been added to Chad. The compound that is listed in Chad's standard is electrolytic iron. Now, for Chad, the WHO recommended compounds are sodium iron EDTA, ferrous sulfate, or ferrous fumarate. And so the results of this analysis from the GFDx are, well, none of the compounds that are in Chad's standards are WHO recommended. The factors that go into identifying whether something is WHO recommended or not is the amount of food that's consumed in that country. So the amount of wheat flour that's consumed per capita per person per capita per day in Chad, and the type of flour that is consumed in Chad. So that's something, this is how the GFDx data could potentially be used to identify where there are countries where there are definitely gaps within those country standards. Next. And just quickly, a lot of you may already be aware of this, but if you're wondering where those resources come from in terms of identifying nutrient compounds and levels, all of these resources are linked on the GFDx, but for rice, you can look at the chapter 13 in the Food Fortification and Globalized World textbook. There is a chapter that does put in there, because there is no WHO guideline, there's a chapter in there that has specified levels on compounds for fortification of rice. For maize and wheat flour, there are two relatively new WHO guidelines in 2016 and 2022, respectively. For salt in 2014, a guideline from WHO came out. And then for other foods and general guidelines around food fortification, there is the 2006 WHO and FAO handbook. Next slide. So the last example I think that I'm going over is, in a much more qualitative sense, what does it mean to have a good foundation for a fortification program? You can have the correct compounds, you can have the correct levels, you know that you're fortifying the right food, but what else is really important to make sure the actual implementation of your program is actually strong? So the example that I'm bringing up here is, globally, fortification partners often point to Costa Rica as a global success around food fortification. And what you're seeing here as the image is again, the Costa Rica country dashboard, but it is a dashboard titled Foundational Review of Documents. So it takes key documents from Costa Rica, their legislation and their standards, monitoring protocols, if GFDx has access to them, has reviewed all of those documents, and has pulled out relevant information for maize flour, oil, rice, salt, and wheat flour, so that we can better understand whether their program has what GFDx considers the minimal essential elements for a strong foundation for a fortification program. So say a neighboring country or a regional country, Peru, they're interested in modeling the same best practices that were exhibited in Costa Rica, and they wanted you to review the Costa Rican program for lessons learned. So what essential information should be well established in policies to ensure a strong foundation for implementation? Now in Costa Rica, you can see that 4 out of 5 of the foods within GFDx do have mandatory food fortification. That's answered by the first question there. Does the legislation or standard document indicate there is mandatory fortification of at least one food vehicle fit for human consumption? This is just also a snapshot. There's actually several more questions underneath, but there just wasn't room for this slide to pull all the questions on there. So I definitely recommend that you go to the GFDx site to look at the full suite of questions. But for example, one of those questions that would be really important to understand whether there's a strong foundation for a fortification program is, on a very basic level. If we look at, I don't know if you'll be able to see my cursor, but is there a document that describes the role in fortification for at least one government agency? And what does it state? And if you were to click on that caret, it would drop down and actually show you the exact text within that document that states, where is the government mandate for monitoring food fortification? And that's really important because if there isn't a document that states who's responsible for food fortification, you can probably be pretty confident that no one is responsible for food fortification. And so there probably is no implementation. Again, it's not exactly saying that we know that there isn't, but there's at least not foundational, a foundational document that states some sort of role for food fortification. So I'm not going to read through all these because that would take some time, but we do encourage you to go through some of these qualitative aspects of what would make a strong foundation for a food fortification program. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I have one more. Okay, so again, how well is our food fortification program operating? You've put in all of the, you've chosen the right food, you've chosen the right compounds, levels. As far as you can tell, you have the foundational elements that you think you need. In Tanzania, mandatory food fortification of wheat flour and maize flour was introduced in 2011 in Tanzania. You've been asked by the Ministry of Health to conduct a 10-year review of the fortification program. Just a couple of your questions, because there are a lot of questions that you should actually be asking when you want to understand how well a food fortification program is operating, is, well, how much additional nutrient intake is being contributed by fortified foods? What does fortified maize flour contribute versus fortified wheat flour? Ideally, you would have dietary surveys that help you answer that question. But within the last 10 years, since fortification was passed, you don't have that data. So what is your next best option? Does a GFDx potentially have information that can help? Next slide. So this is under a global visualization. You can actually, the first visualization is the global maps, and then you can actually choose a country and then see the country specific charts here. So it's a GFDx analysis that takes into consideration the dietary availability or intake within a country, the food standards in the country, and that's the unadjusted scenario. So under this scenario, in Tanzania, it's the ideal scenario where 100% of the wheat flour, 100% of maize flour is industrially processed, and 100% is fortified. So if everything were going as best as possible, what would we expect with the food availability in that country, and what is specified in standards for the addition of folic acid? I actually think this is. So if we look at the potential intake in milligrams per day, it's 0.3 micrograms per day. Percent of the recommended intake is 78%, and the percent contribution to the tolerable upper limit is 31%. And you can see that the amounts that are relatively contributed through maize flour versus wheat flour. So maize flour here in this ideal scenario is contributing more to the folic acid intake than wheat flour. But this is the ideal scenario, and we all know that ideal scenarios are not always actually in practice. So click, please. One GFDx has available about actual percent of the food that is industrially processed in the country, and where we know potentially what actual amount is fortified through perhaps surveys or regulatory information. We have adjusted this potential intake information to then consider what potentially is actually happening in the country. And that adjusted number, you can see, drops down quite dramatically to 0.08, 21%, and 8.6% respectively for these three different charts. And you can see also that maize flour is no longer the main contributor to folate intake in the country. It is wheat flour. And, of course, as the nutrition officer in the country, you'd want to dig deeper about why is this the case? Why is there such a dramatic decrease after the adjustment? But GFDx, this analysis within GFDx can help you try to quantify what decrease that is, but not necessarily tell you why. There is a lot more programmatic digging that you have to do there, but actually help you, give kind of a number to what your expectations should have been. Next slide.
Great, thanks, Becky. So now I'll just take everybody through a regional example of how the GFDx can be used. So let's take this example. You're a director from a regional health community called EXA, and you're in charge of a new food fortification agenda. You have a set of members, all of whom also belong to an economic region called SADC in Africa. Recently, SADC has passed harmonized standards to provide member states with guidance on micronutrient additions to staple foods. And this is meant to provide a minimum addition of levels for these countries to target in order to allow for intra-regional trade in fortified foods and ensure significant intake of key micronutrients within their member states. So as the EXA Health Community Director, you want to know how well your countries in EXA Health Community are faring compared to the SADC regional standards. So here you can see that SADC members have recommendations for a number of staple foods, including salt, wheat flour, maize flour, and edible oil. So let's start with edible oil as an example. So I go to the SADC standards here, and I have the minimum standards set by them. I can go to the GFDx then, and I can compare the national standards for each of the EXA countries in the EXA health community. I first click on visualizations, and then I select the visualization called Nutrient Levels in Fortification Standards. So this takes me to an interactive map, which I can filter on the right-hand side. I can select oil, then vitamin A for the nutrient, and then I can also click on which EXA health community countries I want my map to focus on. And then I'll select data at the bottom, and I'll download my CSV of all the filtered data. So now this takes me to a table of my health community countries, the nutrient levels, the compounds in their national standards, and I can now compare this with the minimum level set by the economic region. So here you can see that Zimbabwe has a target addition rate that is actually below the recommendation. However, if I look a little bit further, the standard does actually align with the regulatory parameters set by the economic region. One thing I would actually note from my work is that Lesotho, Mauritius, Eswatini, and Zambia do not have any standards for vitamin A in edible oils, so that might be a topic I dig into a bit more. So that's just an example from the regional standards, and I think we've come to the end of our presentation. Okay, so now we just want to take some questions from the webinar audience. And just as a reminder, you can submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A button. So now I'll hand it over to Karen to moderate, and we have about 15 minutes. Karen, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. So we've got some interesting questions that I can see in the Q&A. So thank you to everyone who has been supporting so far. Okay, how would you like me to give you these questions? Would you like me to read them out?
Yeah, could you please read them out?
Sure. So Hetty has asked, in country we're using a fortification mix to our staple foods, namely maize flour, later adding wheat flour and bread. Salt is iodized. However, rice is growing in consumption but is mostly imported. How important is import versus locally produced to have mandatory fortification?
Becky, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. That's a really great question. I think it really depends on that country's consumption patterns and knowing where that food comes from. So here it sounds like in the country that you're speaking about, you already know that's mostly imported. It'd be great to know specific amounts. It would be even greater to know, where the distribution of that imported food is being consumed. Is it all over the country? Is it predominantly in the urban areas, etc.? Lacking that information though, it's really important to have as mandatory fortification all of the major sources of that food. So whether to be specified under legislation. So if that food you already know is primarily imported, then yes, your regulation should definitely specify that imported food should be fortified. Locally produced can be a little bit more complex because it depends on the industrial milling situation in your country. I say that because when a food is imported, because of just how it moves through the global markets, it is almost certainly going to be industrially processed. So rice that is imported is always going to be industrially processed, and you can be fairly confident that it goes through a centralized process that can incorporate food fortification. But local production of a certain food, of rice in particular in countries, you want to assess an industry, you want to assess the milling industry to see how well they can actually incorporate food fortification into their practices. How large are these mills? Are they automated mills? Are they running in high capacity? So questions like that, because we have seen cases in countries where they will make exceptions in their standards to, require that only industrial mills fortify food because they're worried about potentially, stifling competition within small mills or inhibiting their production. So I hope that answers your question, but it's a little bit complicated. The most important thing is to make sure all of the primarily consumed foods are reached. Imported foods are always going to be industrially produced, so they should be fortified. Locally produced foods, if they're industrially produced, then they should also be fortified.
Great, thanks, Becky. There's a question from Abe about understanding the market distribution of fortifiable flours. Wondering if you could talk about, in your modelling example, did you account for market distribution pattern of fortifiable wheat versus maize flour in Tanzania, where the bulk of such flour is marketed in urban and peri-urban areas, not nationwide?
I can try to answer that. Abe, are you referring to the nutrient contribution analysis? I assume that's the one that you're referring to. That is a national estimate. So no, we don't take into consider any, subnational distribution patterns within that country. So, definitely if fortifiable flour is going to be more likely consumed in an urban area, then the contribution from fortified flour to fully intake is going to be different compared to in the rural area. We definitely recognize that it would be wonderful, it would be ideal to get that information, but often you do need to have subnational dietary intake level data, and that data is always, there's just a lot of complications in terms of getting access to that raw data, and also just comprehensive global availability of that data to visualize it.
Just wanted to add on to that, Becky. I want to agree that subnational data is very important. And of course, we aspire to getting subnational data at some point on the GFDx, because we know that national data is, of course, a limitation to the platform. And just wanted to mention that where this data is available, where research has been done, particularly nutrition surveys done nationally, I believe GAIN has some publications on market distribution of different foods, but I think it's specific to oil. So I could send over a few publications on that, if helpful.
All right, thank you. There's a question in regards to the food vehicles that have been are being analysed on the GFDx. So Katie's asked, given that there are countries with mandatory sugar fortification, is there a specific reason for excluding it as a food vehicle on GFDx? And she says she understands not wanting to promote the consumption of sugar, but if someone is using GFDx to understand a country's fortification program, excluding sugar could lead to an incomplete picture, say in Nigeria or Malawi. Can you speak to that, Becky or Florencia?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So one of the things that we considered when developing the GFDx was who were the organizations who were collecting data on specific nutrients already, on specific food vehicles already. So at the start of developing the GFDx, Iodine Global Network was collecting all things related to salt. GAIN had been collecting all data related to oil, and then Food Fortification Initiative was collecting data all around wheat flour, maize flour, and rice, so all grains. And so as the three organizations came together, we were limited to those foods, but these also happen to be foods that are the most widely consumed fortified staple foods. So although we don't include things like sugar, milk is another one, ghee, we understand that that's a limitation to the GFDx, but that was primarily the rationale. I'm not sure, Becky, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, no, that's a great explanation. Unfortunately, some of these things are just historical in terms of, organizational mandates. We would love to include more foods. Sometimes it does come down to resource constraints.
Great, thank you. There's an interesting question from Mohammed about whether there's any linkage between fortification and reduction in severe acute malnutrition in terms of dietary intake, especially in developing countries like Nigeria. Can you speak to that?
I can try to touch upon it, but honestly, I don't know if we would want to make a strong linkage because there are a lot, I think, of different contributors to secure acute malnutrition. I don't know if, honestly, this isn't my specialty either, so I do apologize if I'm speaking, out of turn. But I don't know if the exact contribution that is related to vitamin and mineral deficiency has been quantified in terms of its relationship. So I think that you would have to be cautious there. Anybody else want to add?
No, nothing more on that one? Okay. Adding to Abe's question earlier, how important is it to characterise differences within a country of per capita consumption of food vehicles and current levels of nutrient inadequacy in the way that large-scale food fortification programs are designed and monitored?
Becky, do you want to go ahead and try that one?
Yeah, I'm trying to see if I understand this question correctly. So yes, it is really important to understand differences within per capita consumption of food vehicles. And you would ideally use that to identify the amount of nutrient levels or the amount that you would add into standards for a large-scale food fortification program. My caveat to that is just that oftentimes you just don't have that information available. And that's why we often do end up relying on WHO guidelines, because that dietary information and the nutrient inadequacy information just often isn't there. And so you end up using the categories of the amounts of food available in the country to define nutrient levels. Certainly if you had that individual level information, then you could much more you could refine food standards much more closely to that population's needs. But oftentimes we're just working without the data that would be ideal. I certainly don't think that that information is a barrier to introducing food fortification. I think that we do want to be cautious with not preventing, if you don't have the ideal information, not going forward with food fortification.
Great, thanks, Becky. I'm not quite sure what country that this question is coming from, but there's a question of how do you envisage that rice fortification would be carried out, considering that maize flour fortification is so poor? And can anything be done to improve maize fortification? Becky, Florencia?
Yeah, I would say that there are a lot of things to learn from programs that perhaps are not functioning as successfully as they were envisioned. So I think that there are, if you were to look on the Global Fortification Data Exchange website in terms of the foundational documents, there are several documents there that can help guide a country in terms of what can make a program successful and what documents are needed in place to ensure that a program is run successfully. And Becky touched on some of these, ensuring that monitoring occurs, that there's an agency within government that's responsible, that a budget is allocated. There are certain things that set up programs for success. And so I think that it's important to understand what those indicators are and look at them closely within the country. You can look at what has occurred for maize flour and then learn from that for rice fortification. So I'm not sure if Becky, you want to add something more specifically, but regarding the GFDx data, I think that there are some helpful indicators to look at that can help provide or set up the right foundation for a program to be successful.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. The only thing I would add is just because the recommendations would be very specific to a country and their context. So definitely, if you want to talk about a specific country, happy to get in, happy to talk with you specifically about what is going on in your country and what around maize fortification, why potentially there are issues with poor implementation, and how exactly rice fortification might fit within your context.
And just to build on that, we will be having this discussion between now and through August 4th on the Data for Nutrition website. And so that would be a great opportunity to reach out to us with specific questions on your country. If you want to follow up with us, we're happy to help answer some of these more country-specific questions. Over to you, Karen.
Great, thank you. It's a question about the most emerging challenges in Africa, especially in Ethiopia, and drought. So drought has come up a few times, and about drought and food security. But yes, even now there are high food insecurity among rural households. How can we overcome this problem, including with food fortification? So how could food fortification support, I guess, a more secure food line to people in Ethiopia, I think, is the crux of the question. So what can be done by food fortification to tackle or to approach the emerging challenges in Africa, and particularly Ethiopia?
Yeah, I can start with this. Certainly these types of issues are not my expertise, but I would just say that this is pretty timely because GFDx is just now starting a series in our comms and advocacy around the linkage between things like climate change and food fortification. So if you follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter, you'll be able to see some key statistics on the effect of climate change on nutrient depletion in soil and things like that, and how food fortification might help contribute to increasing nutrients in staple foods. So I would say, at least, obviously, drought is a huge issue in and of itself, and food fortification is not a solution, but it could perhaps help by providing staple foods to a country or area in which the staple foods are depleted or there aren't any available if they're imported. But I don't know if Becky, you want to add something.
Yeah, I mean, food fortification directly itself is not going to solve issues systemic as drought, but I think that does point to the need that when there are food aid programs within a country that are trying to alleviate issues like this, that food should be fortified when it's going to those beneficiaries. So I think having policies in a country in place that require donated food to be fortified is something that should always be considered when trying to alleviate hunger and food insecurity in countries like in Ethiopia currently.
Great, thank you. Hopefully that helps answer that question in some way, and that's something that can be looked into perhaps with other interventions also. There's a great question about whether to implement or increase the fortification of staple food in a country. What's your opinion in terms of increased cost for delivery of food fortification, and where will these costs accrue? Is that something that the GFDx has data on, or that you can speak to from experiences elsewhere?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I can take a stab, and then, Florence, if you'd like to add on. We always get questions about the cost of fortified foods. And no, the GFDx currently doesn't have data on the cost of fortified food, but I do just really want to point out that the main cost for fortifying food is going to come from, the main reoccurring cost is going to come from the actual purchase of the vitamins and minerals called premix into the food. Obviously that has to be ongoing. Some short-term purchases that happen once are, for example, equipment by the food producer if they don't already have that equipment. But again, in an industrial processing facility, they will often already have the equipment that they need to fortify a food. But the cost of those vitamins and minerals are a very small proportion of the actual cost of the food. Right now, with inflation going up so much and the cost of food staples increasing, rapidly, the cost of premix really is dwarfed by the cost of the actual changes in the food itself. And so there are a lot of concerns about causing food to become even more expensive, but it is really not going to be a large contributor in terms of the actual cost of the premix. In terms of effects on the delivery channel, there really shouldn't be any changes for most foods in terms of costs added to delivery channel for that food. There's no changes to wheat flour, maize flour, rice, in terms of how the food is going to be handled or stored. Florence, I don't know if you have a different answer for oil, because it is a little bit more light sensitive. Vitamin A is a little bit more light sensitive, but there should not be additional increased costs because of the delivery channel or the delivery supply chain changes for food fortification.
Florencia, anything further from you on that, or is that a complete answer for now?
I think that's good. I think for oil, it's more during the processing stage. Particular things are added during processing, such as free fatty acids or peroxidase, that may increase costs. Also, in terms of the spoilage of the oil, but I wouldn't say it's at the point of delivery per se.
Okay, great. And this might
sorry,
be our fun. Oh, go, Becky.
I just want to add in there that all of my comments are really relevant to mandatory food fortification. I'm just realizing that that's what the attendee might have been referencing in terms of delivery channel. Mandatory food fortification, all the costs should be equal across food producers, and that's why that cost should be, relatively minimal for the consumers. When we start talking about voluntary food fortification, there can be definite increases in the price of the food because producers start marketing the product. It's considered, added value. Their production capacity or their production utilization may be lower than ideal. So, they're trying to basically make up the cost of a product that they may not be selling in as high quantities as others. So voluntary food fortification, you can probably see changes in the cost of that food much more variable than in mandatory food fortification.
Great, thank you. Now, I think this will be our last question because we're getting close to time. There's a quick question about how does adding micronutrient powder to food compare with fortification programs where micronutrients are targeted to 6 months to 5-year-olds? Is that something you could just quickly wrap up in about a minute?
Florence, do you want to take a first stab, or do you want me to do that?
Yeah, go ahead, Becky.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's really important to just be aware that food fortification, mandatory food fortification programs are really intended to target the general population. Standards are always going to be set for an adult population because we want these levels to be safe and adequate. Younger children, vulnerable populations are going to have higher micronutrient needs, and setting standards at those levels may mean that you cause other populations to consume too much of that micronutrient. So food fortification is never going to be the single micronutrient intervention that's needed in a country. Younger populations, like those 6-month-olds to 5-year-olds, should always have their own targeted intervention, because they just may not eat enough wheat flour, bread, to meet their needs through the standards that are fortified in wheat flour. There are certain exceptions to that. There may be exceptions, for example, for like oil and salt in specific countries, but you really would need to know your consumption patterns for those populations to know whether those foods truly would be adequate. And you wouldn't need another program. Another potential exception is countries where, for example, rice is commonly used as a porridge and complementary food, or maize flour is. Those potentially also may be good contributors, but again, they're not going to target and provide the nutrient needs like micronutrient powders will.
Great, thank you so much, Becky and Florencia, for your thoughtful answers to the questions. As discussed, those questions can continue to be asked in our community chat, and I'm going to hand you over to Riley. Will you be taking it from here?
I can pick up from here. So I want to say thank you so much. And again, also emphasizing that there's been so many great questions and comments. I don't think we even got to all of them, but encourage you to take this over to the community of practice and participate in this ongoing discussion. We know that food fortification is just a topic that's getting more and more attention in many of our countries, and that this is a wonderful place for sharing questions, ideas, and interacting more with the GFDx team. So Riley has put that link, I think, in the chat. Encourage you to go to the Data for Nutrition Community of Practice. The next slide. Just want to thank each of you who logged on or who are watching this in follow-up for participating. We also want to say a special thank you to our speakers, Florencia and Becky, and the team from GFDx who brought this together. And we really hope you enjoyed this, and want to remind you that a recording of the webinar is now available on the Data for Nutrition YouTube channel, so feel free to go there if you'd like to share this with any colleagues. And again, we will have some copies of the slides as well as a summary of the Q&A on our webinars group page in the coming weeks. So just take note, for more information about GFDx, there's the website and following them on social media. And we look forward to you joining us for future webinars. Thank you.